Hello and welcome to Topic 3, Lecture 2 on Federalism. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the different eras of federalism. Since the ratification of the Constitution, the United States has had a federal system for dividing power between the national government and the states. But the nature of the power sharing relationship has changed over time. And in this lecture, we're going to take a look at and examine how federalism has changed. And so this graph here just shows you the different eras of federalism. We're going to start with discussing dual federalism, move on to talk about cooperative federalism, regulated federalism, and we'll end the lecture by taking a look at new federalism, the type of federalism that we have in place today. So let's get started. The first era of federalism is known as dual federalism, and it's often referred to as the traditional system of federalism, since it's the type of federalism that's been in place through much of U.S. history. As you can tell from the era date there from 1789 to 1937. So it really is a long-lasting form of or model for dividing power within the United States. In this system of dual federalism, the national government was a lot smaller than it is today, and it also had very narrowly defined powers. And a lot of those powers, as your textbook points out, focused, at least the domestic powers, focused on commerce and economic development. And so, for example, during this time period, as the United States was developing as an economic power, that the federal government would give subsidies to private companies in order to build roads and canals, to have sort of like a comprehensive road and waterway system through the United States, or as far as, they could develop that. There was also the development of the National Bank. We talked about that in our previous lecture when we were talking about the famous Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, having to do with the constitutionality of developing a national bank for the United States. It was constitutional. That was within the implied powers of Congress. But the point of developing a national bank, and we have Alexander Hamilton to thank for this, is they wanted to make sure that the United States currency could get stable and therefore be considered a stable and vibrant sort of currency that the United States could depend upon, but also trading partners would also see our economic system as having some viability and stability. Land grants were also an example of what national government did at this time. And so whether it was land grants that were given to private companies to build the railroad system throughout the United States, or whether it was the effort that the national government engaged in to dispose of public lands, since we had a huge swath of territory west of the 13 original states as a part of the Louisiana Purchase, we did things with those lands. And so the Homestead Act is a good example of that from President Abraham Lincoln, where federal lands were 160 acres of federal lands were given to individuals if they proved that they could develop that land. Then they would take ownership of that land. So those are just some examples of those narrowly defined powers that the national government had during this era of dual federalism. Now, states did most of the governing, okay? And so the national government had narrowly defined but important powers. But as we learned in our last lecture, the 10th Amendment reserves a lot of powers to the states. And so property law, criminal law, education law, family law, etc., all of that was reserved to the states. So states really did much of the governing. Now, you might be wondering, why is there a piece of cake up in that corner? Well, oftentimes the traditional system is known as the layer cake system of federalism. And that's because there are distinct layers. The federal government has a distinct layer, and the state governments have a distinct layer within this. And that cake is sort of like there's one layer that's white, and that's like the small but narrowly defined powers of the federal government. And the rest of it is purple, and that represents the power of the states. This is just a graph from your textbook that shows you a breakdown of those different powers. The national, the state, and then local governments as well. I haven't talked a lot about local governments, but local governments were really involved in having powers at this time period too. But just notice here, I'll put on the little magic pen, just notice here how the national government powers are so like small, and just look at how long the national powers are. I know you probably can't read this in this slideshow, but make sure you take a look at that in your textbook. So the 20th century brings changes to this traditional federal system. And those changes are a reflection of the historical events that are taking place and the way that governments respond to those historical events. And also that changes that the Supreme Court have over time in the way that they've interpreted the constitutional federal arrangement, okay? And so as we know, that like we talked in last lecture about McCulloch versus Maryland, your textbook talks several Supreme Court cases like Gibbons v. Ogden, United States v. Lopez, etc. And oftentimes the questions that come before the court are about what is the constitutional exercise of power of the national government. And sometimes the Supreme Court will say the national government has the authority to engage in that power, and sometimes they say that they don't. And so we see that as the Supreme Court historically changes their understanding of federalism, that will get reflected in the way the power relationship between the federal government and the states changes as well. Now, so in the rest of this lecture, we're going to take a look at the three eras: cooperative federalism, regulated federalism, and new federalism. I just want to say that there's a lot more information in your textbook about each of these eras. So obviously, when it comes to exam time and when it comes to our quizzes as well, you will be responsible for drawing upon not this information in the lecture, but the information from the textbook as well. These lectures should be regarded as an overview of these eras, but a lot more details are in the textbook, and I expect you to read that. So the first era that we're going to talk about post-dual federalism is what's known as cooperative federalism. And it went from 1937 to the 1960s. Cooperative federalism, one way of thinking about it is that it's the type of federalism in which federal grants and aid are given to states to encourage states to pursue nationally defined goals. Okay, so that's kind of the textbook definition of this. But when we think about cooperative federalism, it's really a move away from these are the narrowly defined powers of the national government and the states to basically do a lot of the rest of the governing. Cooperative federalism, as the name suggests, is developing a cooperation between the national governments and the states in order to address big national problems. So let's take a look at what brought about cooperative federalism. Well, what brings about the shift to cooperative federalism? Well, one of the big things that bring about the shift to cooperative federalism is the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is this worldwide economic collapse that profoundly impacts not just the United States, but other countries as well. That there was a collapse of the stock market, there's a general collapse of the economy in the United States, and the Great Depression brings about a high level of unemployment. About 25% of Americans were unemployed without jobs. And when you don't have jobs, you don't have money, and so there was a high level of poverty as well. And so what brings about this shift is that, in dual federalism, states and local governments were the ones who were responsible for providing for the general welfare of its people. The states were responsible for alleviating poverty, for providing social welfare, for promoting, employment training and those sorts of things. But during the Great Depression, they were overwhelmed. States and local governments could not do that. And this was such a huge problem or crisis facing the nation that the national government and the state governments had to work cooperatively in order to solve these huge problems. And so, as your textbook points out, there's a lot more detail in your textbook. The president at that time period, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, him and the Democratic Congress, they passed a bunch of laws that are known as the New Deal federal legislation. And these were federal programs that were designed to deal with poverty and unemployment and providing social safety nets for people federal social safety nets for people that were experiencing these really horrible social conditions as a product of the Great Depression. And so, one thing that that breaks apart the layer cakes and leads to this cooperation is the Great Depression. Another thing that leads to it is the shift in the Supreme Court's, that's what SC stands for there, the shift in the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Don't want to get into too much weeds here, but there's this clause in the Constitution, and it says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce between the states. Okay, that's the Commerce Clause. And so if commerce is taking place between Wisconsin and Illinois, or there's interstate sort of transportation of economic goods, that triggers the power of the national government, and they can regulate interstate commerce. Up until 1937, the Supreme Court said that the Commerce Clause only applied to regulations between the states, not the economic activity within the states, right? And so when it came to things such as labor laws, child labor laws, protective labor laws for women, when it came to collective bargaining, fraud, union laws, that was left to the states. The national government couldn't have these sort of national minimum wage laws because the Supreme Court said, nope, those kinds of national commerce laws are unconstitutional. They're a violation of the Commerce Clause. Well, in 1937, the Supreme Court changed its mind on its interpretation of the Commerce Clause, in large part because there was a lot of pressure from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said that if you don't change your mind on how you're ruling on these, I'm going to pack the courts. And also it was very unpopular, these decisions that the Supreme Court was making. So this shift in the Commerce Clause basically increased federal regulation, not just out between states, but within the economy of states. And so that opens the door for federal labor laws within states, federal minimum wage laws, federal, making sure that there are healthy living conditions within economies or in industry within states. So it's those two things that really bring about this cooperation, right? The Great Depression, and also allowing the federal government to kind of beef up its power in terms of managing the economy, which makes sense since the economy was in such disrepair. And that's an understatement. So how was this cooperation achieved at this time period? Well, the way that it was achieved was, and you'll read about this in your textbook, is through increased reliance on these things called federal grants and aids. And what federal grants and aids are is that in order to achieve these big national plans, like alleviating unemployment or getting people to work, right, that the federal government gave money to states, and that the states had to use that money for a specific national purpose, okay? So it's sort of like we need to build roads, or we need to build new public infrastructure like dams or whatever. Here's state some money, and you can use this money in order to achieve this national goal. And so it built in that cooperation between the national government and the states. One of the largest and most effective New Deal programs was known as the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. It was a federal program that employed millions of Americans in public work projects. And if you've traveled throughout the United States, or even in your own hometown, you will still see buildings that are a product of the WPA. And so they used federal dollars to employ millions of Americans to construct highways, bridges, public parks. And from 1935 to 1943, the federal government spent over $13 billion on the WPA and provided jobs for over 8 million Americans that were previously unemployed. And so it's a real good example of probably one of the biggest and most impactful New Deal legislation, the WPA, and this product of cooperative federalism. And just because I like talking about cake, the cooperative federalism has a cake as well. And so the dual federalism was a layer cake, right? Chocolate layer, vanilla layer, and with icing in between. They had their narrow lanes of power. Cooperative federalism is a marble cake. I don't know if you've ever made the marble cake before, but you put like the vanilla batter and then the chocolate batter, and then you actually take like a toothpick and you swirl it between those different batters, and it marbleizes, right? It's a marble cake. What does that have to do with cooperative federalism, you lunatic, Professor Hankinson? Well, what it has to do is it basically shows that the marbling between federal power and state powers, that was blended, right? That they worked cooperatively to solve big national problems. The next era of federalism is regulated federalism, and it's a relatively short era or period of time. A regulated federalism is a type of federalism in which Congress imposes legislation on states, requiring them to meet certain national standards. And so regulated federalism is oftentimes also referred to as coercive federalism. And so while the power of the national government grew during the era of cooperative federalism, this is really where the federal government is basically dictating to the states, not necessarily working cooperatively, or dictating to the states that there are certain things and certain mandates that they must meet. So what are some of the historical events that bring about this shift from cooperative federalism to regulated federalism? Well, under cooperative federalism, states were sort of like equal players, like they cooperated with the federal government. They were given grants and aid, and then they had some autonomy in terms of how they wanted to achieve these federal goals. And so states are cooperative players, and they have power to implement important policies. And when you give states that much power, there are times when there are differences in terms of the way those policy goals have been achieved state by state. And so in your textbook, they sort of talk about that the way one state might achieve a federal goal could be really different than the way another state achieved a federal goal. And so there could be inequalities when you go from one state to another. Medicare is a good example of that. So, I'm sorry, not Medicare. Medicaid is a good example of that. Medicaid is health insurance for those who are at a lower level of income. In Wisconsin, we called Medicaid Badger Care. And so that you have to meet a certain income level to be eligible for Medicaid. Well, states define that eligibility. So you might be eligible for Medicaid in one state, but not in another state. And then those in Congress, they didn't like that. They thought that there should be more uniformity and less inequalities between states. Another thing that brought about this shift, another historical event, was the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and the backlash that a lot of southern states had to these civil rights laws that were being implemented in the United States. And so there was this sense that the national government felt that they couldn't trust certain states because that there was concern that some states were unwilling to, particularly those in the South, were unwilling to treat all citizens equally, particularly racial minorities. And your textbook talks about this thing called the Alabama syndrome, right? It's sort of like as Congress was passing laws that were supposed to address and improve the economies throughout the nation, and that you would give money to states to come up with how to improve economies, the economic situation. They would say, look, do we really want to hand over federal dollars to the state of Alabama, whose governor, George Wallace, is a known racist, a known anti-segregationist? And they were like, no, we just are lacking trust in some states in the United States. And so the response was for the national government to get more coercive, to not want to see states as these sort of cooperative partners. And so you saw, rather than depending on grants and aid to achieve national goals, you saw a whole slew of congressional or national regulatory laws that were put in place. The Occupational Safety and Health Act is a good example of that basically says that all workplaces must meet a certain national standard. The Clean Air Act of 1970, the Highway Energy Conservation Act of 1974. All of these are regulatory national laws that are basically saying all states must basically meet these national regulations, or else they could get fined. They're achieved through sort of a more heavy-handed congressional regulatory or federal regulatory law, and also that preemption that allows for national governments to override state and local actions in certain policy areas, and so that was the sort of national supremacy to trump state and local laws, that became more constitutionally allowable at this time period. A good example of that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Voting and the manner of voting is left to the states. However, if states are engaging in racist policies as it relates to who's eligible to vote and voter registration and literacy tests and those sorts of things, you get a federal law that basically, like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that says states can't do those things, and if they try to do those things, federal law is going to basically trump these voting laws that you have placed in your states. So those are some examples, but there are more in your textbook about how regulated federalism was achieved. So the last area we're going to talk about is New Federalism, which starts in the 1970s, really gets going in the 1980s, and is sort of seen as the federal arrangement that we have today in the United States. So what is New Federalism? So New Federalism is a type of federalism that attempts to return power to the states through the use of this thing called block grants. So let's take a look at this era in more detail. So what are some of the historical events that brought about this shift? Well, coming out of the 1960s and the 70s, where you have this sort of predominance of liberal movements, civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the yippies and the hippies, there was kind of a backlash to the rise of liberalism and progressivism in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And that's reflected in who it gets elected to office. And so, Ronald Reagan is a really good example of, the beginning of this conservative movement in the United States that, really has a long-lasting impact, really until probably the 1990s in the United States. And so what in part brings about New Federalism is the rise of the conservatives. And conservatives are generally smaller government. And also they're very sort of small federal government, and they're very states' rights-y. So let's just put that up there. And so, conservatives are more likely to have a backlash to the federal government having a strong, heavy hand on states. And so that the conservatives had this backlash to federal preemption. The national government shouldn't tell states what to do. There was also anger about these unfunded mandates, and so that the national government was telling states to do what to do and achieve these national regulations, but they weren't giving enough money to fund for those mandates, and so they basically became an unfunded mandate, right? You have to do something, but we're not going to give you any money to do it. And so that, leads to the sense of, like, in the textbook that talks about devolution, the transferring of responsibilities from federal government back to state and local governments. And states' rights has always been, a hallmark of sort of the conservative movement, right? That the idea that the federal government has overreach and that we should really return to sort of a more traditional way of doing things. Traditionalism is a part of conservatism. And the traditional way of doing things is a small national government that has very specific tailored rights, and that all the rest of that power should be devolved or reserved to the states. And so those are some of the historical events that lead to New Federalism. You read more about it in your textbook. That as we see a rise of conservatism in the United States, we have more conservative justices that are placed on the Supreme Court who have more of a conservative interpretation of federalism. And so, for the first time, that we see in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s, we basically see the Supreme Court finding federal laws unconstitutional, okay? And so you'll read about United States versus Lopez in the textbook. You'll also read about the Prince case having to do with federal handgun and gun laws. And, the Supreme Court begins saying that the national government that the laws that they're putting in place are an overreach of their power, that they don't have the authority to do that. And so we have a shift in the Supreme Court's interpretation of federalism, more back to more of a traditional sense of limited federal powers. Devolution is achieved in several ways, but the main thing I'll point to is this idea of block grants, okay? So grants in aid that we talked about under cooperative federalism are when specific sums of money are given to states and that states can only use that money for specific national purposes. There's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of what states can do with categorical grants and aids. Block grants give states a lot more wiggle room. And so a block grant is basically a federal grant that is given to states, and it might have a general purpose, like alleviating poverty, but it really leaves the state a lot of discretion about how they want to spend that federal money, okay? So again, it's sort of like, hey, states, do what you want with this money. Here's your block grant, and we're not going to have this like huge federal oversight with what you do with the money. And during the Nixon administration, that there was general revenue sharing. We don't really have that anymore at the federal level. But Nixon was sort of like, hey, just give states a chunk of the taxes that are raised at the national level from a national income tax, and share that with the states, and then let them do what they want with that. That fell by the wayside when there was concerns about federal spending in general, but that was another feature that you'll read about in your textbook about that brings about new federalism. Okay, so in conclusion, here are just some critical thinking questions for you to think about federalism, and these are the kinds of questions that will show up on the midterm exam. So what do you think is the proper balance between the national and state government? In other words, of those four eras that we talked about, which one do you think is the best arrangement in terms of the power relationship between the national government and the states? Do you think that these shifts in the power sharing relationship is a sign of a healthy democracy? Or is when you have this shift and this understanding between the national and state governments, and we have a lot of shifting, and we definitely had a lot of shifting from the 1930s onward till today, is that a sign of some sort of illness or some sort of weakness within a democracy? And then thinking about where we are today, new federalism, it attempts to rein in federal power. Do you think new federalism has gone far enough? Do you think federal power has been reined in enough? Should it be reined in more? Or on the flip side of it, do you think that it's difficult for us to achieve big national goals because we are still like devolving power down to the states? And would you like to see a return to a more regulated form of federalism? All right, thanks a lot for listening to this exciting lecture about federalism, and I will talk to you again soon.